This is Radio TV Phono Nut, and here's an oddball stereo amplifier from Japan, probably from the early to mid-60s. It's an Alrad brand. And as you can see on the front here, we have a total of 5 knobs and a power indicator light. We have, and this is what's weird, left tone and right tone, left volume and right volume. And I remember growing up, one of the hand-me-down record players I had no tone control, and it just had separate left and right volume controls, and to me that was always, well, I mean, don't get me wrong, I was glad to have it, but that setup was always a pain in the butt, having to adjust 2 volume controls to get it where you wanted it. It seemed it would have been better just to have a dual gained volume control and then have a balance control. But even those, the models that had a tone control usually had a gained tone control for one knob does left and right, but this one has 2 separate tone controls. Then we have our function selector here. We have stereo phono and auxiliary, and then mono phono and auxiliary. However, if we look at the back, we only have one set of input jacks. So what they're doing, and I've already tested this, is, well, it's been several months since I tested it, but as I recall, the phono section, I think, had some resistors in line with the hot side to attenuate the signal, or it might have been the tuner section, I don't remember. But at any rate, you can only plug in one device into this amplifier at a time, and just set your function switch to whichever one sounds best. Well, let's drop it and wreck it real good, why don't we? And then, of course, our speaker connectors, and they were nice enough to give you a convenience outlet so you could plug your tuner or record changer into it. Here we are with the top cover removed. We have a 6x4 rectifier tube and 2 6BM8s, one for each channel. Now those tubes contain a triode and I believe a pentode section. The triode section is used for the preamp tube, and then the pentode section is for your final output. Yeah, pretty sizable output transformers for such a small amp, and it's fuse protected, which is nice. You're probably thinking, nah, that's the cheapest stereo amp ever made. No, this is not the cheapest one. The cheapest one were some little series string hot chassis jobs that were made during the 60s. It had a 12AX7, a couple of 35C5s, and a 35W4. They sold for under $20. The real cheap version was basically just a chassis with no cabinet on it. You had a left and right volume control and a tone high-low switch, and the next one up was actually in a cabinet, and it had a actual tone control, but you have to be real careful with those since they use a hot chassis. Here's the underside, and as you can tell, someone has replaced some capacitors in here, and it looks like at least a couple of resistors have been replaced. And from what I can tell, whoever did it did a pretty nice job, but it looks a lot better than a lot of the slop that I see coming here. But there are a couple of things here, 2 or 3 things that I'm really not crazy about, and I'd like to change them. Number one is this power cord coming in here where they have it, the big blob of silicone holding it in place, and there's no rubber grommet in the chassis, so I'd really like to correct that, remove that blob of silicone, put a rubber grommet there in the chassis, and either tie a knot in the power cord or use a cable clamp to provide strain relief. Another thing I'm not too crazy about, you see where they added some sleeving over this capacitor lead. Well, apparently they didn't add enough, and you can see right there that there's a chance that bare capacitor wire could get touchy-feely with one of those terminals there, and that could cause some undesirable action, maybe some sparklage, and we don't want that. I won't fault them too bad for this, but they left the original electrolytic capacitor in place, and based on my listening test, it seems okay, but you know, if this was something that you're going to send off to somebody, and this one probably is going to end up finding a new home, I'd rather get that out of there and put some fresh new electrolytic capacitors in there and, you know, make it a little more reliable anyway. This is one of those things that I bought and don't really know why I bought it. I guess you could call it an impulse buy, so probably going to try to make it a little neater and put this thing back up and try to get my money, or get most of my money back out of it anyway. Now, if I really wanted to go all out, I'd redesign this thing and put a ganged left and right volume control and a balance control and a ganged tone control, and make this thing more user-friendly, and might even add more inputs to the back of it, although there's really not much room to add extra jacks. But you know, I could make this thing into something better, but I'm really not going to. This is a bit of an oddity, and somebody might want it the way it is, so we're just going to leave it alone and tie up a few loose ends here, and then we'll be ready to pass this on to somebody. And when compared to some of the little Japanese radios like I've been working on here lately, the component quality and the build quality seems to be a bit better. I know our wiring is a bit bigger than what's used in those cheapo things, and the potentiometers seem to be in nice shape. They turn nice and smooth. This 6X4 looks like a Fomoco branded tube, aka Ford Motor Company, and likely one somebody snitched out of an old car radio to put in this amplifier. And one of the 6BM8s is a Motorola branded tube, and the other tube branding is gone, but there's still an EIA code of 1022, which I believe was also on the Motorola tube. I think that's a Mullard, but I better go look that up before confirming that, because if I'm wrong, I'm sure a lot of people will be waiting to blow up my comments section, so I will look that up and see what 1022 EIA code crosses over to. Originally, this probably had some Japanese branded tubes in it, and of course those probably fizzled out over the years and somebody replaced them with whatever they had on hand. Alright, let's dig into this and neaten it up a little bit, and then it ought to be ready to go. And then who knows, once I fix it up, I might decide just to hang on to it. You never can tell. I'd like to hang on to all this old stuff, but unfortunately I don't have room for all of it, so, and I want some of my space back, so some of it's going to have to go. Okay, before we're taking on something like this, it's a good idea to draw out where everything goes, and that way you won't get confused when you put it all back together. So coming off of the cathode of the rectifier, we have a 40 microfarad capacitor and a 200 ohm resistor, and at the other end of that 200 ohm resistor we have another 40 microfarad capacitor, and taken off of that capacitor is our B plus line to our audio output transformers. And then we have a 1K ohm resistor connected to that same capacitor. And then at the other end of that 1K ohm resistor, we have a 10 microfarad capacitor. And on that particular capacitor is our B plus voltage to our screen grids of the output tubes. And then on that capacitor, we have a 20K ohm resistor. And at the other end of that resistor, we have our final 10 microfarad capacitor. And coming off of there, we connect to our 250K ohm plate load resistors. Okay, what was I saying? In this last capacitor here feeds our B plus through our plate load resistors, one for each tube. That's for the preamp section of the 6BM8s. We have a couple of 250K resistors. And it's a good thing I checked those, because one of them is open. The other one reads 260 something K, which is not out of tolerance. But I'm going to change both of them because it's been my experience these plate load resistors, they seem to take a beating. I can't tell you how many I've seen in these stereo amplifiers, regardless of the brand, that were either way high in value or wide open altogether, so those will have to be replaced. Here's the old capacitor, 240 microfarads at 250 volts and 210 microfarads at 250 volts. I'm using 240 microfarads at 450 and two 22s at 400 because that's what I have on hand. And I tested this capacitor and it's perfectly fine in every detail. I could have left it in there, but you know how it is. It could one section could open up or short at any given time, and since this is likely going to end up going to somebody else, I just think it'd be better for me to replace it. However, I will throw this in the box of resurrection parts for use on such projects. Now, this is what I'm doing. I mounted a terminal strip to the underside of the chassis, and we're going to have all of our resistors mounted there and all the wires off of the various takeoff points. These are the plate load resistors that are going to need to be replaced. I still have not installed this resistor from the rectifier tube to this terminal strip here. I started to try to just put the capacitors on here too, but we've got too much really going on here, and so I think what we're going to do is put another terminal strip on top of the chassis, put the capacitors there, and then if the capacitors have to be replaced down the road, it'll make it easier to change them out instead of having to worry with all this mess. Okay, this terminal strip, all of the resistors and all of the wires that need to be connected are in place. Now we need to put another one on top for our filter capacitors, and these are your plate load resistors here. The originals were 250K. Had to go with 270K. That's pretty much the standard value in today's world. It should still work just fine though. Okay, here's our terminal board for the filter capacitors with the wires that will run under the chassis, and of course we will cut those wires to a more reasonable length before we're done. And something that just happened that may not happen again ever is these mounting centers on this terminal strip actually line up with two screw holes that are on the chassis. So all we got to do now is put our caps on here, mount the terminal strip, trim up the wires, connect them up, and this ought to be good to go. Okay, here's our filter capacitors installed on the terminal strip, ready to be mounted to the chassis. These are all Panasonic 105 degree rated capacitors, so these are good quality that should last for a very long time. Okay, the filter capacitors are now in place, finally. And here's the bottom side. Now we need to correct this little area here where we have this wire that's getting a little too friendly with other things, and I want to get rid of this blob of silicone and attach this power cord more properly. Okay, here's that capacitor lead fixed. It's not going to short out to anything now. We just used a couple of pieces of heat shrink tubing to insulate the capacitor lead, and it's just fine now. And here's the half a tube of silicone that somebody used to hold the power cord in place. I intend to put a rubber grommet here and use either a cable clamp or tie a knot to keep the cord in position, but I just don't like that big blob of silicone. I suppose it will do the job, but I just don't like it. And I don't like power cords rubbing against a bare chassis hole here that could over time compromise the insulation on the power cord and cause a short circuit or shock hazard or sparks or whatever. Okay, I just knotted off the power cord, and the way it's jammed in there, it's not going to go in or out, so it's fine. It's a polarized cord with the hot side wired on the fuse side. Although in this one a polarized cord is really not that necessary because this is a transformer operated cold chassis amplifier, so on sets with a transformer you can sort of get away without the polarized line cord. Alright, I should be able to put some tubes in this now and feed it a signal, and it ought to play just fine. Alright, here we go, plugged into a cassette deck. It seems to have more gain when set to the phono position. Alright, that's both volumes turned down.
We'll be boarding in 5 minutes.
That's right.
Plane to London, leaving on runway down. Next plane to London, and I'm missing him. That babe of mine.
I hate this because sitting here trying to test something, and then first thing you know I let it play too long and I'm hit with a copyright claim that'll probably block my video. I thought we had a problem with the amplifier because one channel sounds a little bit weaker and more muffled than the other, but I determined it was the tape deck by switching the cables around. Now I flip the cables around.
End of
and I can tell that the problem went to the other channel, so yeah, it's this tape deck that's got an issue, but at least it's providing us with a signal source. Tone controls, I can tell they give you a little bit of range, but not much. Yeah, it plays pretty good. This would be best matched with a pair of high-efficiency tube era speakers.
Had a girl named Paul who played the drums all right. The trouble with their relationship was Charlie's appetite.
Yeah, I'd say this is probably good for, I don't know, a couple of watts a channel maybe.
They're always nice. Take the window seat, put down your tie.
Yeah, a lot of what's on this tape is stuff you're not going to hear on your average FM oldie station. But I'll say this does sound better than the little cheapy ones with the 35C5 amp in it.
Just walking by, when I looked in her eyes, and I swore it was winking. So please believe in me.
Okay, I think I'm going to put the case back on this, and then that'll be a wrap on this one.